Has someone ever hated you and you genuinely couldn't figure out why? Not someone you hurt, not someone you wronged, not someone who had a real reason, someone who just decided they didn't like you, someone whose face changes when you walk into the room, someone who speaks about you in ways that have nothing to do with who you actually are, someone who seems almost personally offended by your existence, and you've gone over it 100 times. What did I do? What did I say? What is it about me that triggered this? And the honest answer is nothing. You didn't do anything. You didn't say anything. You simply existed in front of them. And something about that existence created a reaction that feels completely disproportionate to anything you've actually done. This is one of the most confusing and painful human experiences there is, because there's no logic to hold on to, no clear cause, no obvious way to fix it. But Carl Jung had something to say about this that changes everything. He didn't just offer comfort, he offered an explanation, a real psychological explanation for why some people develop intense negative reactions to others who haven't actually done anything wrong. And once you understand it, not only does the hatred make sense, but you start to see it completely differently, not as something about you, as something about them. Stay with me, because this one is going to shift something. Part 1, the psychology of projection, where hatred without reason actually comes from. Jung's concept of projection is the foundation of everything we're going to talk about in this video. Projection is when you take something that is inside yourself, a feeling, a quality, a fear, a desire, an unacknowledged truth, and you experience it as if it's coming from outside yourself, from another person, from the world. You don't see it as yours, you see it as theirs. And here's why this happens. Every human being has a shadow, the part of themselves that doesn't fit their self-concept, the qualities they've rejected, the impulses they've decided are unacceptable, the aspects of themselves they've pushed into the dark because they couldn't integrate them. This shadow doesn't disappear when you push it down. It goes underground. And from underground, it looks for ways to express itself. One of the primary ways it expresses itself is through projection. The quality you refuse to acknowledge in yourself gets projected outward, onto other people. And when you see it in them, you react to it with the exact intensity that you would feel toward it in yourself if you allowed yourself to acknowledge it, which is usually a lot of intensity, because things that get pushed into the shadow tend to accumulate charge over time. This is why projection can look so extreme, so disproportionate, so apparently irrational. It's not irrational, it's just that the reaction is happening to the wrong target. The person is reacting to their own shadow, but they're experiencing it as a reaction to you. And here's the part that explains unprovoked hatred specifically. Some people trigger others' projections simply by existing in a particular way, by embodying qualities that the other person has pushed into their shadow. You don't have to do anything to trigger a projection. You just have to be something that the other person has rejected in themselves. And when you are that thing, when your presence calls up their shadow without them even realizing it, the reaction they have can look exactly like hatred for no reason. Because from their perspective, there is no reason. They just feel an intense negative response to you that they can't fully explain. And since it feels real to them, since it has the emotional weight of genuine reaction, they conclude that you must have done something, or that something about you is genuinely bad or threatening or wrong. But it's not about you. It was never about you. It's about what you represent in the landscape of their own unacknowledged inner world. Part 2, why certain people trigger projections in others. So if projection is about people seeing their own shadow in others, the question becomes, why do some people consistently trigger this reaction while others don't? Why does one person walk into a room and everyone likes them immediately, while another person walks in and something about them immediately rubs certain people the wrong way? Jung's answer is fascinating. It's not random, and it's not necessarily about anything negative in the person being projected onto. In fact, the things that most commonly trigger intense negative projections in others are often positive qualities. Qualities that the person doing the projecting has suppressed in themselves and that they now experience as threatening or irritating or somehow unbearable in others. Confidence triggers people who have suppressed their own self-worth. When someone has spent years convincing themselves that they should be small, that their needs don't matter, that they should always put others first, someone who is genuinely comfortable taking up space becomes almost intolerable to be around. Not because the confident person is doing anything wrong, but because their ease and comfort in themselves throws into relief everything the other person has rejected about their own right to exist fully. The confident person walks in and just is. And the person who has suppressed their own confidence feels something they can't quite name. An irritation, a resentment, sometimes even a rage. They don't know why. They'd probably say the confident person is arrogant or self-centered or too much. But those are just the labels their conscious mind attaches to an unconscious reaction. The real thing happening is, your confidence is showing me the confidence I never let myself have, and I hate you for it. Authenticity triggers people who have suppressed their own truth. When someone has spent years performing, playing roles, saying what they're supposed to say, and being who they're supposed to be. Someone who is genuinely themselves, who doesn't seem to need approval, who says what they actually think, can be profoundly threatening. Because authenticity is a mirror, and some people don't want to see what that mirror shows them. The authentic person isn't doing anything to the people who react negatively to them. They're just being themselves. But just being themselves is the very thing the reactor has given up, and they can't be around a reminder of what they gave up without feeling something intensely uncomfortable. Emotional honesty triggers people who have suppressed their feelings. Someone who can feel deeply and express that feeling without shame. Who can say, I'm hurt, or I'm angry, or I'm afraid, without apologizing for it. Who has a genuine relationship with their inner world. This triggers people who have been taught that emotions are weakness. That feeling deeply is unacceptable. That the only safe response to the inner world is to lock it away and never speak of it. Watching someone else have the emotional freedom they were denied doesn't make them happy for that person. It makes them react, sometimes with contempt, sometimes with dismissal, sometimes with outright hostility. Because your emotional freedom is a reminder of their emotional imprisonment, and that reminder is unbearable. Success triggers people who have given up on their own potential. This is one of the most common ones, and one of the most painful to be on the receiving end of. Someone who has decided, consciously or unconsciously, that they can't do the thing, that their dreams are not realistic, that they should settle, that trying and failing would be too humiliating. When someone else tries and succeeds, when someone else does the thing they told themselves couldn't be done, it doesn't just fail to inspire them, it enrages them. Not because they wish you harm, but because your success is a direct challenge to the story they've been telling themselves about why they couldn't. And that story is the thing that's been protecting them from the grief of their own unlived potential. Your success makes that grief suddenly visible, and they direct that grief outward, at you. Part 3. The types of people most likely to trigger projections. Jung noticed that certain types of people consistently attracted more projections than others. More intense reactions, more unprovoked hostility, more of what we're calling hatred for no reason. And what he found was that the people who most commonly attracted these reactions were often the people who were most individuated, most themselves, most willing to be different from what the collective expected, the person who doesn't need approval. Most social systems run on approval, on people wanting to be liked, wanting to fit in, wanting to be validated by the group. And this creates an implicit contract. I will conform to the group's expectations, and the group will accept me. The person who doesn't need this approval, who is genuinely indifferent to whether the group likes them or not, disrupts this contract. And that disruption is experienced by people who are dependent on approval as threatening, as arrogant, as thinking they're better than everyone else. But the person isn't thinking they're better than anyone. They're just not organizing their behavior around being liked. And that freedom, that genuine freedom from the need for approval, is something that people who lack it find intensely provoking. The person who sees clearly, someone who is genuinely perceptive, who sees beneath surfaces, who notices what's actually happening rather than what's being performed. Empaths often fall into this category. People with high emotional intelligence. People who have done enough inner work that they're not easily fooled by personas and performances. This kind of clear seeing makes some people deeply uncomfortable because being seen accurately, especially by someone who might see the gap between who you present yourself to be and who you actually are, feels threatening, and the reaction to that threat can look like hostility, like wanting to undermine or dismiss the person who sees clearly. Because if you can make them seem unreliable or wrong or bad, you don't have to worry about being seen by them, the person who has done their inner work. Someone who has genuinely worked on themselves, who has faced their shadow and integrated it, who has real self-awareness, who doesn't project their unprocessed material onto others the way most people do. This person is often experienced as somehow unfair by people who haven't done that work, as if their groundedness and clarity are an accusation. It's not an accusation. They're not doing anything to anyone, but their psychological health throws others' psychological struggles into relief, and that can generate real resentment. The person who lives differently, someone whose choices in their lifestyle, their values, their relationships, their priorities, are genuinely different from the norm. Not performing difference, not being different for effect, but simply living according to their own authentic values rather than the values prescribed by their culture or community. This person often encounters intense negative reactions from people whose own conformity cost them something, whose own choices feel like sacrifices they made because they had no option, who resent the implied freedom in someone else's different path. Part 4. What the hatred is really saying. Here's where Jung's insight becomes most practically useful. If you understand projection, if you understand that the hatred directed at you is actually about the other person's shadow, then the hatred itself becomes information. Not about you, about them. Every time someone hates you for no apparent reason, every time someone reacts to you with intensity that doesn't match anything you've actually done, they are accidentally revealing something about themselves. They are showing you what they have pushed into their shadow. The person who hates your confidence is showing you that they have suppressed their own self-worth. The person who hates your authenticity is showing you that they have abandoned their own truth. The person who hates your success is showing you that they have given up on their own potential. The person who hates your emotional openness is showing you that they have locked away their own inner world. The person who hates your clarity is showing you that they are afraid of being seen. The intensity of the reaction tells you how much charge the shadow material carries. The more intense the hatred, the more deeply buried and the more significant the shadow content. This doesn't make the hatred okay. It doesn't mean you have to stay in the presence of it or accept mistreatment because you understand where it comes from. But it means you don't have to carry it as though it belongs to you. Because it doesn't belong to you. It belongs to them. And more specifically, it belongs to the parts of themselves they've been refusing to acknowledge. Part 5. Why good people get targeted more. Here's something that seems counterintuitive, but that Jung's framework explains clearly. The people who get hated for no reason most often are frequently not the worst people in the room. They're often among the better ones. They're the ones who are genuine, who are kind without agenda, who are trying to do the right thing, who are working on themselves, who are showing up honestly, and they're the ones who get the most intense, most irrational, negative reactions. Why? Because goodness, genuineness, and psychological health are among the most powerful triggers for projection in people who have suppressed those qualities in themselves. Jung understood this as something almost paradoxical. The more authentic you are, the more you trigger the inauthenticity in others. The more psychologically healthy you become, the more you highlight the psychological struggles of people around you. The more you live according to your genuine values, the more you disturb people who have abandoned theirs. This is not a reason to become less authentic or less genuine or less psychologically healthy, but it is a reason to understand why you're a target and to stop interpreting the targeting as evidence of your badness. There's a specific dynamic that happens in group settings that's worth understanding. Jung observed that groups, families, workplaces, communities have a collective shadow just like individuals do. The group pushes certain things into its collective shadow. Qualities that don't fit the group's self-image, emotions the group doesn't want to acknowledge, truths the group finds uncomfortable, and the person who embodies those qualities, who carries the qualities the group has pushed into its shadow, often becomes the scapegoat. The group projects its collective shadow onto them, and the negative reaction of the group toward them is experienced as entirely justified, as this person being problematic, as this person needing to be excluded or corrected or silenced. But what's actually happening is the group is punishing this person for carrying what the group refuses to acknowledge in itself. This is the psychology of scapegoating, and it explains why good, genuine, authentic people often find themselves on the receiving end of group hostility that seems to have no basis in anything they've actually done. Part 6, the empath experience. Why sensitive people are particularly vulnerable. I want to talk specifically about empaths here, because this dynamic, being hated for no reason, is something empaths experience with particular frequency and particular pain. And understanding why helps enormously. Empaths are unusually perceptive. They see beneath surfaces. They pick up on what people are actually feeling underneath what they're presenting. They sense inconsistency between someone's words and their actual emotional state. They notice the unspoken dynamics in a room. This perceptiveness is a gift, but it's also a source of projection triggering, because people who are hiding something, people who are performing a version of themselves that doesn't match their inner reality, people who have built an entire persona around not being seen, can feel genuinely threatened by someone who sees clearly. They can't always articulate what makes them uncomfortable. They just know that around this person, they don't feel safe, that this person might see through them, that their carefully maintained persona doesn't quite hold up in the presence of someone who perceives accurately, and so they react, sometimes with hostility, sometimes with dismissal, sometimes with a campaign to undermine the empath's credibility or reputation, sometimes with a hatred that seems to come from nowhere. It doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from the threat of being seen. And there's another dimension to this that's specific to empaths. Empaths, because of their sensitivity, often carry things for the people around them. They absorb the emotional content of their environment. They process things that others leave unprocessed. And sometimes, people can sense this, not consciously, but at some level, they know that this person sees them, knows them, carries something of them. And for people who are not comfortable being known, who have built their entire sense of safety around not being seen, this is deeply threatening, so they attack the person who sees them. Not because that person did anything, but because their presence is a threat to the armor. If you're an empath who has experienced being hated for no reason, this is very likely a significant part of what's happening. You didn't do anything. You didn't say anything. You just saw them, and they couldn't tolerate being seen. Part 7, the specific thing Jung said about this. Let me now get specific about what Jung actually said that applies directly to this experience. Jung had a concept he called the constellation of the shadow. He observed that certain people, simply by their presence, constellate or activate the shadow of others. They bring the shadow content to the surface without anyone doing anything deliberately. He wrote about how the person who has integrated their own shadow, who has done the inner work of acknowledging their darkness, becomes particularly visible to people who haven't done that work, because the integrated person isn't projecting their shadow outward. They're holding it, living with it, acknowledging it. And this creates a kind of psychological contrast with people who are still projecting. The integrated person's lack of projection makes them seem almost confrontational to heavy projectors, even if they're the gentlest, most non-confrontational person in the room. Because unconsciously, the heavy projector senses, this person is not playing the game. They're not projecting their shadow onto me. They're not confirming my projection of my shadow onto them. They're just clear. And that clarity is unbearable. Jung also wrote specifically about what happens when someone embodies a quality that a group or individual has suppressed. He said the reaction is almost automatic, almost instinctive. It bypasses rational thought entirely. The person who has suppressed their joy reacts to someone genuinely joyful with something that looks like contempt. The person who has suppressed their ambition reacts to someone genuinely ambitious with something that looks like moral outrage. The person who has suppressed their sensitivity reacts to someone genuinely sensitive with something that looks like dismissal or cruelty. These reactions are not chosen. They're not consciously generated. They arise from the shadow directly, which is why they can seem so irrational to the person on the receiving end. Because they are irrational, in the sense that they're not coming from the rational mind, they're coming from the unacknowledged, unexamined, unintegrated parts of someone's psychology, and you, simply by existing in front of them, became the trigger. Part 8. What not to do when someone hates you for no reason. Understanding the psychology helps enormously, but understanding alone doesn't protect you from the impact. And there are some specific things that people tend to do in response to unprovoked hatred that make the situation worse. Don't try to explain yourself endlessly. The instinct when someone hates you for no reason is to prove that you're not who they seem to think you are, to show them evidence of your goodness, to explain your intentions, to make them understand. But here's the thing about projection. The person who is projecting their shadow onto you is not actually reacting to who you are. They're reacting to what you represent to them. And explaining yourself doesn't address that. It can actually make it worse. Because the more you engage, the more you seem to need to convince them, the more it can feel like confirmation to them that there's something to be suspicious about. The person who needs to intensely prove they're not what someone accuses them of sometimes ends up looking less trustworthy, not more. Not because the accusation is true, but because the desperation to disprove it reads as something. Don't internalize their story about you. This is the most important one and the hardest one. When someone hates you, when they tell a story about you that doesn't match who you actually are, there's a powerful pull to take that story in, to wonder if maybe they're right, to start seeing yourself through their lens. Their story about you is not about you. It's about their shadow, and you taking it in and treating it as truth, carrying it, letting it shape how you see yourself. Is you doing their psychological work for them? You don't have to agree with how they see you. Their perception is not reality, and you have your own direct experience of your own intentions, your own character, your own inner world. Hold on to that, especially when someone else's projection is very loud. Don't become what they accuse you of being. Sometimes when someone accuses you persistently of something you're not, when someone treats you as if you're a particular type of person, there's a psychological pull to eventually become that thing. This is called a self-fulfilling prophecy. Or in psychological terms, it's related to what Jung called living out the projection. If someone consistently treats you as untrustworthy, as aggressive, as difficult, as bad, there's a subtle pressure to eventually conform to that picture, to stop fighting it, to just become it because at least then the treatment would make sense. Resist this, because becoming what someone falsely accused you of being is the ultimate loss in this situation. Don't invest in making them understand. This one is painful because you want them to understand. You want to be seen accurately. You want the situation to be fair. But here's the truth. The person who is projecting their shadow onto you is not in a position to see you accurately, not because they're stupid or malicious, but because the projection is running, and the projection is very powerful. Making them understand would require them to take back the projection, to own the quality they've been directing at you, to do the psychological work of acknowledging their shadow, and most people are not willing or able to do that work on demand, or without a significant catalyst. You investing enormous energy in trying to make them understand is usually energy that would be better spent elsewhere. Part 9. What to do instead. So if you shouldn't explain yourself endlessly, shouldn't internalize their story, shouldn't become what they accuse you of, and shouldn't invest in making them understand, what should you do? First, understand what's actually happening. This is genuinely the most powerful thing, because when you understand that the hatred is a projection, when you can see clearly that this is about their shadow, not about your reality, it changes the emotional weight of it. It doesn't make it not hurt, but it means you can hold the hurt without also carrying the self-doubt. Without asking, what did I do? Without wondering, what's wrong with me? Without letting their story become your story, you can hold the impact of being disliked or hated without it meaning what your mind wants to make it mean. Second, stay grounded in who you actually are. This sounds simple. It's not. When someone is projecting intensely onto you, when there's a whole narrative about you circulating that has nothing to do with your actual experience of yourself, staying grounded in your own self-knowledge is a genuine practice. It helps to have people in your life who actually know you, who can reflect back an accurate version of you, who can say that's not who you are when the projection tries to colonize your self-concept. It also helps to journal, to write down your own experience of situations, your actual intentions, your actual feelings, not as a defense against the projection, but as a way of keeping your own reality clear and present for yourself. Third, consider what the projection might be showing you about yourself. Jung would add something here that's important. Even when a projection is mostly or entirely about the other person, it's worth asking whether there's any small grain of something in it that's worth examining. Not because you need to accept their entire story, but because even projections sometimes land on something real. Sometimes the quality they're accusing you of is not theirs alone. Sometimes it's something in you that's worth looking at, even if the way they're expressing it is completely distorted. This is not self-blame. It's just honest self-examination. And it's what separates genuine psychological work from simple self-defense. Fourth, protect your energy without becoming defended. You don't have to stay in the presence of someone who is projecting intensely onto you. You don't have to subject yourself to the ongoing impact of someone's hatred just because you understand where it comes from. Understanding the psychology doesn't mean accepting the mistreatment. You can understand completely and remove yourself from the situation. Protecting your energy is not the same as becoming defended or closed. You can set limits on your exposure to certain people and dynamics without building walls around yourself that keep everyone out. The goal is to be genuinely open and genuinely boundaried at the same time. Part 10. What this says about the person who hates you. Let me say something here that might be unexpected. The person who hates you for no reason, the person whose projection has landed on you, is suffering, not in a way that excuses the behavior, not in a way that means you have to accept mistreatment or stay in their presence, but in a real and significant way, because carrying a large shadow is painful. Living with unacknowledged parts of yourself that are constantly seeking expression and constantly being pushed back down, that takes enormous energy. It creates anxiety. It creates the need to constantly find external targets for what's happening internally. It creates a relationship with the world that's fundamentally adversarial, because the world keeps reflecting back the things you're trying not to see. The person who reacts to your confidence with contempt is someone who has spent years suppressing their own right to exist fully. That's not a comfortable place to live. The person who reacts to your authenticity with hostility is someone who has been performing for so long that they've lost contact with their own truth. That's not a comfortable place to live. The person who reacts to your success with resentment is someone who has given up on something they cared about. That's not a comfortable place to live. Jung didn't say this to generate sympathy for people who project their shadows onto others. He said it to point toward the truth that projection is not a sign of power. It's a sign of psychological pain. And the people who are most driven to project, who cannot be around certain qualities without reacting intensely, are usually people who are most cut off from their own wholeness. This doesn't mean you should try to fix them or save them or help them integrate their shadow. That's not your job. And trying to make it your job usually ends badly. But it does mean you can hold what's happening with some compassion alongside the self-protection. Understanding that the person who is hurting you is also hurting. Not justifying the behavior, but seeing it clearly. Part 11. When it becomes about something else, I want to be honest about something. Not all unprovoked hatred is about projection. Not every negative reaction you get from others is them seeing their shadow in you. Sometimes, people just have bad days that affect how they treat others. Sometimes there are misunderstandings that haven't been cleared up. Sometimes you have a personality clash with someone that doesn't require a deep psychological explanation. Sometimes people are dealing with things that have nothing to do with you that affect how they show up. Jung's framework of projection is a powerful explanatory tool, but it can be misused. Specifically, it can be misused to avoid legitimate feedback. If multiple people in your life are consistently having negative reactions to something about you, if there's a pattern that follows you across different contexts and different relationships, it's worth asking honestly whether there's something in the pattern that belongs to you, not because everyone who reacts negatively to you is right, but because genuine self-awareness requires being willing to consider that possibility. The test is whether you're using "they're just projecting" as a way to genuinely understand a dynamic, or as a way to avoid looking at yourself. Genuine projection leaves you clear about your own experience of the situation. You know your intentions. You know your behavior. You can examine it honestly and find nothing that matches what the person is accusing you of. When you're avoiding your own reflection, when the accusation lands with more internal resonance than you want to admit, that's different, and it deserves honest examination rather than deflection. Jung would say, the framework of projection is a tool for clarity, not a shield against accountability. Part 12, the deeper gift in being a projection target. Here's something Jung said that's genuinely counterintuitive. Being a consistent target of other people's projections, being the person who regularly gets hatred for no apparent reason, can actually be a sign of psychological development. Not always, not automatically, but often. Because the further along you are in your own individuation, the more you've integrated your shadow, the more authentic and genuine you've become, the more you constellate the shadow of people who haven't done that work. The most individuated people Jung observed were also, in many cases, the people who received the most intense negative reactions from others. Not because they were doing anything wrong, but because their development made everyone else's shadow more visible. This is not a comfortable insight, because it means that becoming more psychologically whole doesn't necessarily make people like you more. In the short term, it can sometimes make certain people like you less, but it does mean that the hatred aimed at you is a strange kind of testimony to the fact that you're carrying something genuine, that you're being something real, that your presence is significant enough to constellation a response. This doesn't mean you should be grateful for being hated. You don't need to embrace being a target, but you can hold it with a different relationship to it. Not as evidence of your badness, not as a puzzle about what you did wrong, but as part of the territory of being genuinely yourself in a world where many people are not. As an inevitable consequence of having integrated parts of yourself that other people are still running from. The person who has never been hated for no reason, who is universally liked and never triggers anyone, is often someone who has become very good at being inoffensive, at smoothing away everything that might disturb, at making themselves small enough that nothing about them calls up anything in anyone. That's safe, but it's not growth, and it's not the life Jung was pointing toward. The life he was pointing toward requires being willing to be seen, to be real, to be fully yourself, even when fully yourself makes some people deeply uncomfortable. And yes, some of those people will hate you for it, not because of who you are, but because of who they haven't become yet. Closing so. When someone hates you for no reason, Jung's answer is not, "There's something wrong with you," and it's not, "They're just a bad person." His answer is something more precise and more interesting than either of those. He's saying, you have walked into someone's psychological landscape, and your existence has activated something they've been trying not to see. Something they pushed into their shadow a long time ago. Something that lives in them as an unacknowledged, unintegrated part of who they are. And because they can't see it as theirs, because the shadow by definition is the part of yourself you don't acknowledge, they see it as coming from you. And they react to it in you the way they would react to it in themselves if they ever had to face it. With hostility, with contempt, with a hatred that seems to come from nowhere because it comes from somewhere so deep in them that even they don't have access to it. This is not your fault, and it's not your responsibility to fix. Your responsibility is simpler and harder at the same time. Stay grounded in who you actually are. Don't let their story become your story. Don't let the projection colonize your self-concept. Don't make yourself smaller in order to stop triggering people who are running from themselves. Keep becoming yourself. Keep integrating your own shadow. Keep living with the authenticity and the genuineness and the clarity that you've worked to develop. Some people will hate you for it. That's the cost of being real in a world where being real is not the default. But the alternative, becoming small enough and inoffensive enough and smoothed away enough that nobody's shadow gets activated, is a much higher cost. It's the cost of yourself, and that's not a cost worth paying for anyone's comfort. Thank you for watching. If you recognized yourself in this video, if you've experienced being hated for something you genuinely couldn't explain, leave it in the comments. Because you're not alone in this. And sometimes just knowing that makes a difference. Subscribe for more content about psychology, self-understanding, and the deeper patterns of human behavior. See you in the next one.